Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. I'm Cris Alvarez and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Bear, author of Machine, a White Space novel, published by Gallery Saga Press, October 6, 2020. She is a Astounding Award winner, a Hugo Award winner, Locus Award winner, and also I'd like to touch on, if we can, on Safari and Relay and Carcosa with Gun and Camera. Published a Kindle story in tour. So thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
So Machine, so it's a series, but how did this, considering all the different things as a writer, you have, all kinds of ideas in your head. Tell me about how this series and then this book in the series came about.
Well, it started in 2014. Mm-hmm. I had kind of been focusing on fantasy for a while rather than science fiction, mostly for reasons of sales numbers and what the audience seemed to be there for. Mm-hmm. And Simon Spanton, who at that time was an editor at Glance, approached me and asked me if I had considered writing a space opera. And I said, yes. Yeah. So I had quite a few ideas saved up, I guess I should say, because I think the last science fiction, novel-length science fiction I had written before that was the Jacob's Ladder books, mm-hmm. which were back in the 2010s, or not the 2010s, the actual 2000s, mm-hmm. the noughties.
Right. So tell me about this particular book in the series, Machine. Can you tell me about the protagonist, setting, and conflict, what you focus on here?
Absolutely. The protagonist is basically the deep space equivalent of a flight surgeon, mm-hmm. on a air ambulance.
Okay.
Except she's a rescue specialist. She's a doctor who's a rescue specialist in space. Mm-hmm. And she and her crew are sent out on a mission to approach what they assume is a 400-year-old derelict spaceship, mm-hmm. And discover that the crew is in cryogenic suspension and that there's a modern spaceship that has docked with it whose crew is mysteriously incapacitated. Mm-hmm. And they then start attempting to find out what happened. Mm-hmm. And it's been an interesting book to have out this year because, of course, I finished it and handed it in last year sometime.
Okay.
And having a medical mystery with where they're trying to stop a pandemic from breaking out, which is what eventually turns out to be going on, mm-hmm.
Come
out in 2020 has been a little emotionally complicated. Mm. It's interesting. There are an equal number of, I would say that mostly the reader response I have gotten is very positive. There have been a few people who've been very angry with me. And all I can do is attempt to explain that this is not an attempt to cash in on our current tragedy. This is something that, something that was written in 2018, mostly.
People have to remember that the whole process takes a year or more to get it out. So you didn't anticipate this happening. So.
No, I really didn't.
So, but in that vein though, if say you had known this was coming or, that this was a danger, of a much more distinct danger that was likely, do you think there were parts of the book you might have changed or approached differently or you're satisfied with how it is right now today?
I think, I am, because I did a lot of research in prior pandemics and epidemics, while writing the book. And I also, back in the 1990s, a million years ago, when I was young and fresh-faced and innocent, I worked in the microbiology department of a major metropolitan hospital, doing procedure manuals and general admin work. So I do have, and I come from a family. My mother was a hospital administrative professional, so I do have a background in healthcare, and have always been very comfortable writing, healthcare professionals as protagonists and as characters. And I don't think I would have, I wouldn't write it any differently. I would choose maybe to have it come out next year, or last year.
Interesting. But
because I feel pretty confident in how I wrote the medical aspects of the book.
So with that, so now that we're experiencing the pandemic, did that give you ideas for future novels? Anything that would discuss the current situation in sort of a fantastic or science fiction setting?
Well, it's interesting because now that this has happened, of course, it's part of history, right? If we're writing science fiction set in our world, it has to take the coronavirus pandemic into account as a thing that happened, much like, just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or, and I do think we're going to be seeing a lot of very pandemic-influenced stories in the next few years. I remember after 9/11, which was right when I was breaking into the field, I'd been writing for years, but that's when I finally sort of hit the critical mass of being a decent enough writer to sell. That there were a lot of stories that were obviously influenced by that particular national trauma.
Right.
You can't help processing your trauma through your art. It's baked in. You can't stop being who you are. This is why I find it funny when people complain about art being political. All art is political. It's just that when we agree with the politics, we don't notice it.
Right. Yeah. Do you think, we're kind of going a little bit off topic of the book, but this is interesting. Do you think now with the pandemic, do you think that sort of makes earlier science fiction, I'm not talking about your work necessarily, but just everyone, does it sort of make other works dated, seem like they're part of a different world now since they don't take this into account? You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's interesting. It's one of the things that I remember being sort of a talking point among historians as we were coming up to 2017, 2018, was how the so-called Spanish influenza, which it seems likely actually originated in Kansas, but there's a lot of backstory there involving Woodrow Wilson and not so much freedom of the press during World War I. It was like the forgotten disaster. That it had sort of been erased from national consciousness. And now, of course, we're all talking about it again because the parallels to our current situation are so striking in so many ways.
Right.
But including, executive incompetence and, people who think it's a hoax and so forth and so on. And so the situation there is, I wonder if in 40 years we'll all have kind of scrubbed this out of our memory again. Is it going to be the sort of thing where when I was a kid in the 70s, people still talked about the polio epidemic in the 50s, but I don't remember hearing about. I heard about the Spanish flu because my great-grandfather got it and survived.
Okay.
And I heard that was how I heard about that. But other than that, it wasn't part of the national consciousness. So I don't know. I feel like whatever trauma we're undergoing globally or nationally at any given time tends to take up so much of our attention and it's so personally relevant that we tend to forget that there are going to be entire generations of people who won't have had this incredibly peculiar experience of doing almost everything remotely.
Yeah. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Bear, author of Machine, and also On Safari and Relay, and Carcosa with Gun and Camera. You can find more information about her work at elizabethbear.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or chrisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. And now back to the podcast. Well, we have a generation now, in college who didn't experience 9/11. So, to them, it's history. So, and in a sense, I don't want to say they're forgetting, but it doesn't have the impact. As you live through history, you feel it, and you feel where younger people just don't quite, connect in the same way. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I remind myself, I'm going to be 50 next year. I remind myself constantly that 1980 is now as far away in time from us as 1940 was from 1980.
Yeah.
Which is a little painful to me, but it allows me to remember that, in the era of Netflix, people actually will still get my Knight Rider jokes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like you can almost say to people, you're repeating history again. I've literally seen this before, and you're doing it again, and yet people won't listen. Some people won't listen.
Some of what's going on now is very reminiscent of what went on during the HIV epidemic.
Yeah. So let's talk about, your safari. I guess it's not quite a novelette, or it's a novella, or
it's a novel. Yeah, novelette. I think it's about 10,000 words. I think
you've done other works in this Lovecraft sort of universe, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if any of the Lovecraftian stuff I've written is in the same universe. I've done a lot of either my first or my second professionally published story. I can't remember now which one whether it was the first or the second one. Back in, I think it must have been 2002, was a story called The Follow Me Lights, which is also about Lovecraftian fish people. But from also from a different perspective. I think because I encountered the works of Lovecraft when I was in my teens, and then later encountered his, shall we say, his more racist, the more racist portions of his oeuvre, and came to understand what a dysfunctional and unwell person he was, and how, again, we talk. This takes us back to the trauma reappearing in the art, right? His xenophobia and his agoraphobia, and you name it, it shows up in what he wrote. And I think that somebody or another in the depths of the internet recently proclaimed that, and I can't remember who said this, I'm very sorry, whoever you were, that Lovecraft, the horror in Lovecraft is all about white men discovering they're not the center of the universe and going crazy. And so it sort of seems really relevant to me right now.
Yeah.
Given the resurgence of white supremacism and not just in the U.S., but sort of worldwide, or at least Western civilization, quote unquote civilization wide.
I've actually asked this question of an academic who's written about the history of horror, and that's, so my question was, if horror is so attached to the fear of the unknown, is horror sort of a healthy, and I'm generalizing here, is it sort of healthy, to enjoy horror or get into horror if it's really just about expressing one's own xenophobia or fear of unfair fear of others?
We're seeing horror is not my specialty. I am by no means a scholar of horror. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that we're seeing a real reinvention and reclamation of horror tropes as seen through the eyes of marginalized people. And there's that kind of, and obviously this is a theme that has run through the genre for ages. It's the basis of everything Shirley Jackson ever wrote, basically, is that ordinary people are terrifying and terrible, mm-hmm. and can behave in absolutely horrific ways. Mm-hmm. And so we are definitely like seeing that sometimes the stuff that is normalized is the real horror. Yeah. And I think that that's probably extremely healthy. It allows us, we really are at a point where we need to take a hard look at, culture and history and see how it is that we normalize things like death camps. Mm-hmm. How it is that in a society, anyone can, people can accept horrible things happening to people who are not like them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a thing that, as a genre, science fiction and fantasy and horror, as a collection of allied genres, I guess, mm-hmm. can be instrumental in revisiting and reexamining, because there is so much problematic stuff that is part of our legacy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I enjoy horror. I don't want to say that it's not worth writing, but it's just a question I have, exploring, like you say, the basis, the foundation of fictional writing. But so where did this safari story come from? Was that something someone suggested you write, an idea you had, you just wanted to get out there?
So the funny story about this story is that I have literally been working on it, or I literally worked on it for 30 years. I came up with the title and the first sentence in 1989, the summer before I started college. Mm-hmm. And then I could, it wouldn't let me go. I kept pecking away at it. Mm-hmm. And there's a Richard Brautigan poem called The Amelia Earhart Pancake, which is in the internets if you Google it. But the text of the poem is basically, I've been looking for a poem to go with this title for 17 years, and I'm giving up. Yeah. And the date. I never quite reached that point. Mm-hmm. I knew the story was there. I knew who the protagonist was, but it turned out that I needed like the advancements of, consumer DNA analysis. I needed general awareness of global climate change. Like I needed all of these things to come together to make the foundation for the story that I had, because I had like the idea of this person who's a woman and a physicist and is kind of marginalized because she has a job in a traditionally male field and she's not conventionally attractive and so forth and so on. And it turns out that, she's actually related to, the quote unquote decayed Lovecraftian families. And that was her conflict, but I could never get it all to come together into a piece. Mm-hmm. But I knew I wanted the Lovecraftian bad guy to be the protagonist. Like I knew I wanted to take that othering apart, mm-hmm. and that's also why the story is told in the first person. you know, it's her narrating her own experience and sort of claiming her own identity.
Okay. Oh, I just wanted to double check. It's a Kindle book. Oh, okay.
Yes, it's a Kindle book. It's also available on the Tor.com website for free if you do not wish to, you know, pay the 99 cents or whatever it is to read it at your convenience on your e-reader.
Okay.
It's edited by Ellen Datlow, who is also the person who bought that first Fish People story of mine 18 years ago now.
Oh, wow. And I interviewed,
yeah.
I've interviewed her, and I have that posted. That's an earlier episode on this podcast. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. She's a fantastic editor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was a great conversation. So you mentioned already some of the background you have in the medical sciences. Was there any additional research you did for either the Safari story or Machine, for those works?
Oh, I mean, tons. I read a lot of nonfiction and a lot of you know, science magazines, and I still think of them as magazines, although they're all like, you know, in my e-reader now.
Yeah.
But you know, popular science magazines, because Scientific American and like that. And I'm always, you know, I blame Carl Sagan for most of it, because I was just the right age to become completely fascinated by cosmos and all of his speculation about what life forms in wildly different environments might look like. So there's, you know, so that's a lot of getting to play with all the weird ass aliens.
Yeah.
The people who think we're extremophiles is great fun. And I also sort of like I mentioned in the afterwards the book that the Corps General is inspired by, you know, it was a deep debt of gratitude to James White's Sector General stories. And I also really wanted to, which I love, because they are space opera that doesn't involve either military empires or, you know, they're not, it's non-military space opera. And I would love to see more of that. It's such a rare thing. It's an underutilized set of tropes.
And I'll ask this tongue in cheek, does that even exist?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I think the White Space books are non-military science fiction. There's some military stuff going on in the background, but the protagonists are not military. C.J. Cherryh does a lot of stuff with mercantile freighters, people who are basically just people in space living paycheck to paycheck. Arkady Martin's new series is diplomatic space opera. There is military backstory, but the protagonists aren't shooting anybody except as an absolute last resort.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it does exist. It's just not super common.
Yeah. And I like my share of military sci-fi, but yeah, sometimes you just want to read about, peaceful exploration and, investigation into something new without getting shot at or some organized military trying to kill you or capture you for that reason. Yeah.
Or even just, there are a lot of, space is hard.
Yeah.
as NASA likes to remind us.
Yeah.
And so I feel that there's a lot of adventures to be had that, outside of the military hierarchy in space.
No, I'd say fantasy also has I feel like a lot of it is, fighting and war and empires and kingdoms and all that. And everyone's a warrior. So, and again, it's fun, but sometimes I'd like a little change. So,
yeah.
So what are some of the things that inspire your work? And that could be books, music, shows, even games, video games, board games, anything that sort of gets your imagination going.
Oh man, wow, that's a hard question. Because everything, you never know. Often what happens, it's on Safari is an extreme example, but I very often have like what I know is part of the idea for a story, and then I just sit around waiting for the other like 3 pieces to show up and click with it. Travel is great. I read a lot of nonfiction because I find that when I'm reading fiction, what I wind up getting caught up in the narrative and the world building of that piece. And so sometimes I might write something reacting to it or arguing with it, like the Lovecraft stories. But more often I find myself going, oh, what a cool idea, when I like listen to a, radio story on a street artist, or I'm trying to think of like some specific examples of things that just really clicked for me. I'm reading Peter Pomerantsev's book on media manipulation right now, and not only is that extremely enlightening about the modern media environment, but it's also given me a lot of ideas in terms of stories about how propaganda works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there a particular, say, that you find yourself going back to more often than others, either media or specific subject matter?
I mean, I studied anthropology in school, and the idea of the basic tenets of I say modern anthropology as if this wasn't 30 years ago now. The idea of taking a modernist and deconstructive approach to things, and like looking layers and layers down, which is an elaborate way of saying what Theodore Sturgeon said many years ago, ask the next question. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where, where do you get your ideas? Just keep asking questions until you get to the thing that you don't understand, and then write a story about the thing you don't understand. Mm-hmm. I think most of my stories are arguments with myself, like often ethical or philosophical arguments with myself. Mm-hmm. If I know the answer to something, I don't feel any need to write a story about it.
Mm-hmm. And which side of you tends to win the arguments? Or is it...
I am. You know how people tend to accuse. I think I have a lot in common with Barack Obama and the ACLU in that. If I were a Libra, I'd claim I'm a Libra, but I really have a tendency to hold a lot of conflicting ideas in my head at the same time. Mm-hmm. And a very good friend of mine described me once as cagey. So I really find it hard to commit to an absolute course of action on most things. I would be a terrible executive.
Though I was going to ask, maybe your approach is circumstance based, that when the time comes and the decision is to be made, you've looked at everything at the different angles, and that maybe you're ready to just act immediately when the time is right. Sometimes.
Yeah. I think, somebody or another, there was some interesting research a while back. And this is how like everything goes into my brain. Yes, I read this thing once. I don't remember where or who said it. Mm-hmm. There was some interesting research a while back that suggested that one of the better ways to make a decision is to obtain as much information as possible, mm-hmm. and then go with your gut. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's actually what I do, but it seems like a sound theory to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As long as you can maintain an open mind while obtaining that information.
Right. I think that's the important thing. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Bear, author of Machine, and also On Safari and Relay, and Carcosa with Gun and Camera. You can find more information about her work at elizabethbear.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or chrisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. And now back to the podcast. Would you say, or what would you say if Machine or the White Space series in general had a soundtrack, what would you say it would be?
Oh gosh. I used to listen to a lot of music while writing,
mm-hmm.
and I've discovered that I can't do it anymore. My focus suffers too much. I think I'm using. I think it's taking more processing power for me to write these days.
Mm-hmm.
But I did write large chunks of Machine to the Wonder Woman score. So movie music still works. I just can't listen to anything with lyrics in it.
Right.
So you could definitely superhero music is apparently.
Okay. Is that sort of the aesthetic that the series has, sort of like a gradual rise to heroic action, or it's not like a pulsing kind of fast beat?
Well, I mean, I hope so. I intentionally said, when my first novel came out, somebody described it as Heinleinian, and I didn't think it was particularly Heinleinian. And there are ways in which when I was writing Ancestral Night, I did in fact set out to write a sort of Heinleinian novel, in that it's got a first-person narrator. They spend an awful lot of time floating around in space on long, boring trips, philosophizing.
Yeah.
It's, there's sections of sarcastic banter. So in some respect, I would say that the structural, I mean, Machine is definitely sort of a play in 3 acts. It's got 3 structural narrative sections, without too many spoilers. There's, like each act takes place in a different feeling space, at least for me as the writer.
Okay.
Machine is more straightforward in that respect.
Okay.
They're also both pretty long books by my standards. Not by everybody's standards, but they're both were contracted at 150,000 words, and they came in right about there.
Okay.
So there's a lot of room in there to sort of play around and go down little side trails and have, give secondary characters some time. I hadn't originally planned to write Ancestral Night with a first person single narrator. I had originally intended to write a very different book.
Okay.
And I was about, I don't know, I was 3 or 4 chapters into it when the 2016 election happened, and a lot of the character of just sort of the vibe of the United States changed overnight. And I had to go back and like really retrench what I was writing to get something that I was in the correct headspace to write.
Interesting. Well, let me turn to how you do your writing. Is there anything out of the ordinary in your view that you do to complete your drafts or the final draft?
Not really. I joke that there are, there are 2 kinds of writers. There are the ones who believe in false dichotomies, and then there's everybody else. Because people like to sort of plug themselves into camps as a pantser or a plotter.
Right.
And I'm not by any means like a strict outliner, but I also am not somebody who just kind of has no idea where I'm going. Often I write the first third of a book kind of groping along. And then I have to go back and then I figure out what the ending is, and then I have to go back and revise it so that it supports the middle of the book. So I do everything wrong. I don't follow any of the advice on how to write. I don't, let's see, the never go back and edit before you finished a thing. I edit. I mean, the easiest way for me to write is to sit down, edit the previous day's work, and then write today's, because it gets me back into the headspace and the narrative flow. I revise paragraphs as I write them. I'm not a very linear thinker, as you may have detected from this conversation. So often when I write a paragraph down, everything's in the wrong order, and I have to go back and fix it and put it in a sensible sequential order before I can write the next paragraph. So that's probably the weirdest thing I do, is I write stuff just any which way. And if I have an idea for a scene that's going to happen, I'll jump ahead, or I'll write bits of dialogue that I know are going to come later in the book out of order. And I tried using Scrivener, and discovered that it was way too linear for me, which seems weird for a product that's designed to let you move scenes around effortlessly. But so I just work in one giant, very ugly Word file, which has all of my scraps of stuff and outline notes stuck at the end, and occasionally has a bracket that says "insert scene here" when you figure out what it is. When I was earlier in my career, I would often write a scene without knowing what structural purpose it served. Now I more frequently find that I know what structural purpose something needs to serve, but I haven't yet figured out what happens in it, because I'm much pickier about what happens in my scenes.
Okay.
I've gotten all the low-hanging fruit. Now I have to work harder.
Right. So with this, for the machine, you said it was supposed to come in at 150,000 words. I think you said that. Did you overwrite it first and then edit it down, or did you just hit the mark pretty much right with the first draft?
I am a chronic underwriter. I am the anti-Stephen King. The Stephen King thing about the second draft is your first draft minus 15%. I am the exact opposite. My second draft is my first draft with all of the transitions and exposition added. Okay. I tend to one of my editors constantly reminds me that I do not have a transparent head, and explain things like character motivations and backstory, and because my attitude is, the reader will figure it out. And I think that's because I read wildly inappropriate literature at a young age, and I didn't understand half of it. So if I don't understand something, I just assume that I'll figure it out later.
Interesting.
But it turns out that many people find this approach frustrating, and so I have to go back and put in a whole bunch more exposition and basically just all the stuff that I skim over when I read.
Yeah.
I don't actually skim over it, but it just the stuff that I know, like in my bones, then I have to go figure out how to verbalize it and put it into the second draft. So I think my first draft of both of them was probably about 130,000 words.
And so,
and they both grew extensively on revision.
So did it take a beta reader or the editor to point out, hey, this part needs a little bit more clarification, or
My main editors on both books were Novel Wolf and Gillian Redfern. And they both were really excelled at pointing out places where I was being unclear or ambiguous, or where my joke wasn't as funny as I thought it was. I did tell Nava that I would buy her an ice cream cone for every joke that she didn't get that I left in anyway.
Yeah.
I think I owe her like 5 ice cream cones. So.
Yeah.
I haven't seen her because plague.
But she's waiting for that ice cream.
She's lying in wait. Absolutely. She earned it.
But that gives her an incentive to pretend she didn't find jokes funny just to get more ice cream.
Oh, see, you're much more devious than I am.
Yeah. So you mentioned one approach to your writing that's changed over time. Are there others? Anything significant as far as, and especially since you won awards for your first novel, how did that impact how you wrote, or did you just keep on?
You ask good questions. Okay. I don't think that, I think that you have to, okay, so awards are fabulous. They are delightful. They are concrete evidence that somebody really liked this thing that you put your heart and soul into. Mm-hmm. But you have to keep your eyes on your own paper and on the work you're doing currently, or you will drive yourself absolutely crazy. Mm-hmm. You can't, because everything in this business is so arbitrary. You can have absolutely stellar year in terms of sales and awards and whatever one year, and then next year nothing, crickets. And there's and the writer has almost no control over that. Mm-hmm. Because no matter how much promotion you do, or how much you put yourself out there, or how much you get on Twitter and say, buy my book, or how many events you do, what really always gets a reader to pick up a book is Patrick Nielsen Hayden, who's a publisher at Tor, mm-hmm. Says that, based on their market research, the number one reason that a person buys a book is because they've already read something else by that author and loved it. Okay. The number 2 reason that a person buys a book is because one of their friends shoved it under their nose and said, dude, you got to read this. And that's not his phrasing. He doesn't sound like a it doesn't generally sound like a super dude. But and I certainly know that I have bought any number of books because a friend shoved them under my nose and said, dude, you got to read this. Mm-hmm. Like that's, and you can't buy that. You can't, it's entirely got to be, so in order to maintain my sanity, I have really tried to divorce my sense of self-worth from those external metrics. Mm-hmm. They're lovely. They're extremely gratifying. I certainly, when I'm having a crappy day and I can't seem to find the right adjective and I'm like, I will never finish this book. I have been known to go into the other room and look at my Hugo awards. It's been known to happen. Yeah. Be like, look, you did it before, okay? Yeah.
Hey.
But it's also just not so they're lovely, but you can't let them control your output. I guess you can't write to the award. You can't write to the market because the market's going to have moved on in a year. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got very lucky with the White Space books, and I actually got a little lucky that I wound up, because of a bunch of family health stuff and various other crises that are boring, I had to get an extension on the first one, and it wound up coming out in 2019 rather than 2016 when it was originally supposed to come out. Also because I had to go back and start over. Oh, wow. And because in that interim space, Ann Leckie became an absolute phenomenon, and suddenly space opera by women was the thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so so that, commercially speaking, that delay worked out for me.
Good.
On the other hand, you know, but you can't predict that.
Right. Yeah.
There's no way to control that. So you just kind of surf it when it happens, and when it doesn't, you remember that the world is arbitrary and unfair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is what writing fiction always is. Well, it's not always saying that, but I guess in the end, the hero always. Yeah, I'm not even going to go down that road.
No, unless you're writing modernist literature.
Yeah.
If you're Samuel Beckett, things might be a little different.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned some of the work you've done, non-writing work that you've done, that's influenced how and what you write. You know, the medical work. Is there other stuff that's impacted your work?
I mean, everything does. Like the family you grow up in, the culture you grow up in. Mm-hmm. There's, you know, the places you live. I wrote a book about Las Vegas because I lived in Las Vegas for 6 years, 6.5 years. So you, like, every experience you have somehow gets baked into what you write. I write a lot of things set in New England because I know New England very well. I grew up here, you know, so it's effortlessly for me to write New Englanders behaving like New Englanders. I don't have to think about it. It really is like a Stephen King novel. It's, my husband is from Minnesota, and moved out here to Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And after the first winter in this big weird old house with our just like, he's like, everybody in this town is out of a Stephen King novel. I thought he had an imagination. It turns out he's just a realist. I'm like, you're not wrong. I used to describe it as, you know, like living in an episode of Newhart, but nobody remembers what Newhart was anymore. So, because it was 40 years ago.
Newhart, yeah, that was a funny show.
Yeah.
I'll say
it's
that.
Accurate. Completely accurate.
I'll say I always enjoyed ghost stories and stuff, but I never really believed in ghosts until I spent an evening in a Maine bed and breakfast, an old historic bed and breakfast, and that kind of had an effect. I'll say that. Yeah, that's and again, I'm a scientific kind of guy, you know, but there's some weird things out there. So of all the places you've lived, and maybe this is unfair to ask, which has had the most atmosphere, or the most sort of hidden worlds within it that you found most fascinating? Oh,
wow, that is hard, because there's always, like, of course, when the place where you live when you're in middle school and high school, there are all of those, kid legends. Mm-hmm. Like, these woods are haunted, or, somebody died in that sewer tunnel or whatever. And of course, it's all absolute nonsense, because somebody's older brother was dragging them back in 1962, and it's gotten passed down through every high school class since.
Yeah.
I mean, the place where I live now has an awful lot of history. Mm-hmm. Vegas was interesting because, and the book that I wrote about, sort of the mystic history of Las Vegas, takes this into account. Vegas is interesting because everything gets plowed under after 10 years. Mm-hmm. Like the life cycle of a Vegas casino is new hotness, not so new, not, new hotness, bastion of the strip, kind of seedy and rundown, mm-hmm. Hollywood set for a movie, implosion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's how it works. And so that very transience is so baked into the place, mm-hmm. that it becomes like part of its zeitgeist, part of its like nothing is real. Everything is phantasmal and ephemeral, and will be gone again in, if not this year, next year.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually had to set the novel in a very specific year and make it apparent in the text what time frames it's set in. It's called One-Eyed Jack.
Okay.
And but it takes place in the 1960s and in 2002.
Okay.
Sort of well, and so because if you describe a building, it might not be there next year. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that was like, for that reason, that was the setting that had the most effect on my writing, of my actual crafting of the book. When I wrote The Stratford Man, which is an Elizabethan fantasy, I went to, as part of my research for it, I went to England, which was my first time in my life traveling overseas. And I like went to all the places in the book. And of course, 400 years has gone by, but I still felt like I could get a sense of like the quality of the light and the landscape and the way things sounded and felt. And that was really important to me in making that book feel as textured and alive as I wanted it to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So, bit of a whimsical question now. When you were younger, was there a power technology or fictional setting you wanted or that you yearned to be part of?
Oh, is this the what superhero would you be question?
Sort of, but it's a little broader than that.
Well, I mean, I used to, so I read Anne McCaffrey's Pern novels when I was quite young.
Mm-hmm.
So, about reading adult literature at an inappropriately young age. And I desperately wanted to be a dragonrider. So that was like the thing I wanted. That was my life goal.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that there's no clear career path toward dragonrider. 1980s, 1990s America. So that got put by the wayside.
Was there someone telling you that yes, there was a chance? Someone sort of playing with your young mind? Oh
no! I was probably 8 or 9 years old, so I was a little. I had a sense that dragons weren't actually real, sadly, and that space exploration wasn't real, sadly. Although I got somebody gave me one of those coffee table books of Cris illustrations of derelict spaceships, and I think those have entirely created my spaceship aesthetic. I keep writing about these giant derelict hulks floating in space, and it's all Cris Foss's fault. Mm-hmm. All of it.
I think I know that. If my memory is correct, I think I know who you're talking about, and I like that stuff a lot as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was in Omni too back in the day.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, like that aesthetic is so that and Thundar the Barbarian. Like growing up in the 80s gives you such a post-apocalyptic aesthetic.
Yeah.
Just everything was tattered.
Yeah.
It's probably overused word in my work is tattered.
Yeah. Yeah, I just looked up Cris Foss. It is the same art. And yeah, Omni magazine. Again, that's a magazine that I read when I was young, and maybe it was a little bit older than I should have been reading in some aspects. But
nobody stopped us.
No.
And we okay.
I mean, if your kid is reading, and just engrossed in something, are you going to say, take that away, and it's.
Yeah, no, I just let them, they'll sort it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a feeling, well, your parents sound like they were more scientific, but I think some parents see like sci-fi and fantasy and they're just like, okay, I don't get this, at least back in the day,
Yeah.
And they're like.
But I'm a third generation science fiction fan on both sides of the family. So I basically got I got the run of my mom's library, which may not have been the wisest decision on her part, but I'm not terribly I'm far more traumatized by other things.
Okay.
But yeah, one of my grandfathers was a Asimov and Clarke fan, and the other one liked Howard. The guy who wrote the Destroyer books, he had all of those.
So, did you have access to like any of the original Pulp Fiction magazines or the original books that were published, like back?
Yeah, my mom had a whole bunch of Damon Knight's Orbit anthologies and like the really old year's bests, and I think she must have gotten those from her father, because that wasn't, well, some of it might have been her stuff, but she was more in the Ursula Le Guin, C.J. Cherryh, like that was her her real niche as a reader, as a fan. And so, yeah, I read a lot of the older stuff as a kid. I also read, like, she really liked the New Wave, so I read an awful lot of New Wave, and then kind of discovered cyberpunk on my own in high school and as I was getting into college. And I had a really weird relationship with books as a kid. Like, I didn't realize they had chronology. You know, they were just sort of a natural resource that existed. I
see. I think I see.
I was probably in my early teens by the time I realized that more books in a series would come out, because it was, you know, there would be new ones. I was probably like, I don't know, like a preteen, not, you know, not that books weren't sort of a natural resource that had to be mined, that they were a thing that got made, and that the people who made them weren't people from the dim mists of history, but quite possibly people alive and working today.
Yeah. So did you play any role-playing games?
Oh, yeah. I was in sixth grade, I think, I had the Red Box Dungeons and Dragons set. And I was kind of nerdy and unpopular, and also a girl, so I didn't really have anybody to play with.
Oh.
But I memorized all the rules, and I made up characters, and I did like all of that stuff. Built dungeons. But then in high school, I fell in with a gaming group. And we played a lot of, what did we play? We played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which would have been the first edition in those days. And we played a certain amount of Marvel superheroes. And then in college, and Call of Cthulhu also. And then in college, we sort of, I clicked in with a gaming group at the University of Connecticut, many of whom I am still friends with today.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So that was actually really good for me, because I went from being, you know, like the only girl gamer I knew to being part of a group that was probably 60% female.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which was really, really great for me socially. My female nerd friends before that had been like Trekkies and so forth.
It makes me...
There's nothing wrong with Trekkies. I strongly identify, okay? But they weren't gamers.
Yeah, I dabbled in, I don't know if you... Villains and Vigilantes, Boot Hill, James Bond.
I have played a tiny bit of Villains and Vigilantes. One of the guys who ran a bunch of games in the larger group I hung around with in college, ran a lot of V&V. Because I was the person who was running a lot of Call of Cthulhu, I wound up not playing in a lot of other games, because you know how it is, the game masters never get to play.
Yeah. You just get to torture everyone.
You just get to torture everyone else, yeah. But we were all sort of working out of the same player pool and occasionally played in each other's games.
That's cool. Yeah. You don't still play, do you? Or did you?
Currently, I have a once-a-month Pathfinder game, which is it is taking place over Discord for the time being.
Right.
But which it turns out works surprisingly well as a tabletop RPG platform. I haven't run anything in a while because I discovered that I can either write or come up with scenarios. It uses the same part of my brain, and I can't switch back and forth on the fly. But I think a lot of the ways that I plot books is very similar to how I plot games, in that I create an interesting situation and then I drop a lot of characters into it and I see what they do. It's just that I'm playing all of the characters instead of just half of them.
Right.
So that, but that was, and so I can't seem to run a game effectively while I'm writing. But I still play. I've done a couple of exhibition games for Pathfinder and so forth.
And what character class do you prefer?
So right now I'm playing a sorcerer, draconian sorcerer. She's a lot of fun because she's not very good at this human social interaction thing. So mostly I hang around in the background of the party, wait for a fight, and freeze things.
Oh, okay. Hey,
that's my job.
Yeah.
But I'm the weirdo who likes playing combat clerics. I find that very rewarding because there's always something you can do, like in almost any situation. And I also, I like a good thug.
Okay.
I like a good thug. It's nothing wrong with tanking a little and hitting things.
So
my spouse is the rogue in the household. He likes playing assassins and thieves and so forth.
Who is? I missed that.
Oh, my husband.
Oh, okay. He likes the assassins and rogues, the ones stealing from fellow party members, though.
I have not yet seen him doing that, and currently he's playing a noble ranger.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, just to get back to the book now, so you mentioned some of what it took to finish it. Do you have any other difficulties getting it finished or published?
Well, published wasn't hard, because I, was writing it, because I sold it on a proposal.
Right.
I'd say it wasn't hard, obviously selling anything is hard, but, and I've been doing this. My first novel came out at the end of 2004, late enough that it was technically considered a 2005 book, and I still get rejected all the time, It's a thing. It's just, it never goes away, which is another reason not to worry too much about what everybody else is doing, but just to focus on your own work. Because you only see you only see everybody else's highlights reel.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it was just, I think the hardest part for me was that I had a real problem with this book that I don't usually have. I had 3 interlocking plot threads that were all supposed to weave together and come to a satisfying conclusion. And I was kind of, I was modeling my plot structure on kind of an Agatha Christie thing. There's a mystery and a solution to a mystery and a somewhat elaborate scheme.
Okay.
An unreasonably elaborate scheme, but hey, this is fiction. You can't have a good caper without breaking a few eggs. So I was definitely thinking of the Agatha Christie plot structure, where there's a lot of people with different motivations doing different things, and they all get in each other's way and cause problems for each other. And I realized like halfway through the book that I had one too many.
Hmm.
And so I had to go back and unperson a secondary character and take out an entire plot thread and just rip that whole thing out, because it was just because it's in the outline doesn't mean it has to be in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was clutter. It was clutter, and it had to go.
Okay.
Sad, because I liked that character, but you know what? I folded their plot role into another character, and thereby had a much stronger, had one stronger secondary character as opposed to two that weren't doing very much work.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Makes sense. So what's your current writing project?
I am currently somewhat overdue. See above global pandemic, somewhat distracted on the third book in the Lotus Kingdoms trilogy, which is called The Origin of Storms, and which was supposed to be handed in June, and for some reason it did not get handed in at the end of June. But I am hopeful that I will have it done by the end of the year or January at the latest. And I feel kind of bad about it because my editor is retiring, and she can't actually completely retire until I hand this damn book in.
Oh boy!
which is why we try not to be too late on things, because it's the problem with the publishing industry is that the entire thing like hangs on so many one person linchpins. The writer's got to get their job done, and the cover artist has to get their job done, and the editor has to get their job done. And and any one of us can be derailed by, moms in the hospital, or getting a divorce, or any of the other, or retiring, or any of the other million things that happen in a average person's life to throw you for a loop for a year.
Yeah.
And so I'm feeling a lot of emotional pressure to get this dreaded thing done.
Oh, I see.
Because a lot of people, I'm annoying a lot of people by being late.
So where can people find you online? Social media or website?
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find online because I'm elizabethbear.com. And there are links to Twitter and my newsletter, and so forth and so on.
Okay.
Right at the top of the page.
Okay. And that's Bear as in BEAR, ElizabethBear.com.
Yes. Bear like the animal.
Got it. Okay. All right, cool. So, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
I'm just really, really enjoyed this interview, and I'm grateful to have gotten the chance to talk to you. This has been a delight.
Oh, yeah, it's been fun. Thank you. I totally appreciate it. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, please subscribe and rate it if you can. If you want more fiction and fiction studies ranging from ancient mythology to modern-day sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. On my webpage, you'll also find written interviews and links to my social media accounts on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I also discuss art, acting, comic books, gaming, and much more. Thanks again, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.